just go on. The other class has a pretty set curriculum, and the videos that go with it and so forth. And this is all of my own devising. So yeah, for better or worse. Right? We were talking 2 weeks ago about the notion of the Messiah, why people have a need to focus on a Messiah. Sometimes when things get really bad, that's when people start reaching for supernatural help. Right? And I talked about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when things got worse under the Romans, even after the temple was destroyed, and how Bar Kokhba was kind of messianized. And even Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Chabad Rebbe, because he became Rebbe in 1951, right after the Holocaust. And they've just begun to deal with the implications of that after reorganizing and after the beginning of the state of Israel and saving the remnant and getting them resettled wherever they got resettled. And then it's time to say, well, it must be time for redemption now, because we've dealt with all the practical stuff, but we haven't gotten to the ultimate solution yet, right?
Okay, a lot of the Chabad people considered him the Messiah. Did anyone ever trace his lineage to prove he was from the house of David?
No, that's not been done. I mean, there are those who would try, but it's certainly not been done convincing, right? So there are many points that the rabbis emphasized about the Messiah. I'm going to share a bunch of them with you today. And that's important only because how we think about the Messiah was shaped not only by the prophets, but also by what the rabbis had to say in the Talmud. Right? And certainly for the rabbis, the purpose of religious life was not to get to salvation, but constant sanctification, seeking holiness, seeking a holy life. Right? And that's always possible no matter how bad things are. So what I'm going to do for you is summarize a significant part of the Talmud and what it says on this subject. Right? So it says one 3rd century rabbi says, the appointed times for the Messiah have already come and gone. And so all we have left are repentance and good deeds. In other words, it was supposed to happen before, but it didn't. And so now we just have to live a good Jewish life, which is repentance and good deeds. Right? Other speculation on this subject. The Messiah will come when all the people repent for a single day, or if they observe a single Shabbat according to the Torah. Yeah. Or the Messiah will come when things get really, really bad. Okay? Or of course, when things get really, really good. Right? During the generation, here's a quote from the Talmud. During the generation in which the Messiah, son of David, comes, Torah scholars decrease, and for the rest of the people, their eyes fail with sorrow and grief, and troubles increase. In other words, so it gets really bad. Not now. Okay? And the harsh decrees will be introduced. Before the first passes, the second quickly comes. In other words, you think it can't get any worse and it's going to get worse. Right? And with regard to the 7-year period, there's the sabbatical cycle where, the land is supposed to rest every 7 years. And so there's messianic significance given to that too. And because, in that cycle, in the 7-year cycle in which the Messiah comes, during the first year, this verse will be fulfilled, a verse from Amos, which says, I will cause it to rain upon one city and not rain upon another city. In other words, God will sort of show what's coming by giving rain here, but not there. In other words, this place is going to be blessed and another one is going to be cursed. Right? During the 2nd year of that period, arrows of famine will be shot, meaning there will only be famine in certain places, right? If you're one of the lucky ones, you won't have famine, but it'll be like, places next door to each other.
Sounds like Exodus.
During the 3rd year, there will be a great famine, and men, women, children, the pious, and men of action will die, and the Torah will be forgotten by those who study it. During the 4th year, there will be plenty, but not great plenty. During the 5th year, there will be great plenty, and they will eat, drink, and rejoice, and the Torah will return to those who study it. In other words, all those Torah scholars who forgot their stuff, their learning, they'll get it back. During the 6th year, heavenly voices will be heard. And during the sabbatical year, wars will be waged, like the war of Gog and Magog, involving the Jewish people. And during the year after the conclusion of the sabbatical year, that's when the Messiah will come. Okay? It is taught in a Brighton. Rabbi Yehuda says, during the generation that the son of David comes, the hall of the assembly of the sages will be designated for prostitution. And the Galilee will be destroyed, and Bashan will be desolate, and the residents of the border who flee the neighboring Gentiles will circulate from city to city and will receive no help and no sympathy. The wisdom of scholars will diminish, sin-fearing people will be despised, and the face of the generation will be like the face of a dog in its impudence and shamelessness.
Things are looking up, huh?
Yeah, not. Yeah, Lou?
I was always under the understanding that the Talmud was more or less a discussion about Mishnah and Torah, and does any of this that you just talked about come from Torah and Mishnah?
Not directly, no. It is just their speculation, sometimes wildly based on a verse from scripture, and sometimes not.
There's no
Right.
like
It's,
introductory.
there's
verse to this
nothing in the
particular-
Mishnah about any of this. I mean, you should understand, the Talmud has just a ton of stuff in it that,
It goes everywhere. I know that.
yeah, it goes all over. Okay? During the generation in which the Messiah comes, youths will humiliate elders, and elders stand in deference before youths. A daughter will rebel against her mother, and a bride against her mother-in-law. Boy.
Haven't we already- haven't we already walked down that path?
And the fate, I'm not getting there. And the face of the generation, okay, will be like the face of a dog, and a son will not be ashamed before his father. Yeah. It is taught that Rabbi Nehemiah says, during the generation that the son of David comes, arrogance will proliferate, and the cost of living will corrupt people, so they will engage in deceit. The vine will produce its fruit, but the wine will be costly. And the entire Gentile monarchy will be converted to the heresy. What's the heresy in that time? Christianity.
Oh.
Christianity. And there will be no inclination among the people to accept rebuke. Bad times, right? And finally, says the Messiah will not come until they despair from the redemption. As it is stated, there's a verse, there is none shut up or left, as though there were no supporter or helper for the Jewish people. Now, the point of all this is there's no single rabbinic position on the Messiah. Now, Maimonides tried to kind of carve one out at the end of his Mishnah Torah. He believed that when the Messiah comes, there would be no disruption of the natural order, no big upheaval. Right? Now, the rivers will not flow with wine, and people will not fly like angels, and there would still be poor people, right? But the main difference, Israel would have peace and national independence, political independence, and they could focus more on studying Torah and worshiping. And there would be some byproducts from peace, because when there's no war, it's obviously a lot easier to get the essentials of life,
Oh, yeah.
right?
All the money
Probably
we
no
spent.
pandemic either with the,
Right.
you know, the backup in the ports and whatnot, right? So in other words, what Maimonides tried to do was to kind of demythologize all this stuff about the Messiah. It'll be a normal time, just a whole lot better, right? You know, the idea of the Messiah was also a little bit of a, you know, a trap of, you know, a personality cult. If you look at the history of false messiahs, right, many of them were just, you know, these incredibly charismatic personalities. One of the most famous of the false messiahs, I won't say anything about Jesus, but you know, you wouldn't report me to your Christian friends anyway if I told you that. But
Nope.
but yeah, in our religion, Jesus is a false Messiah. Although with better intentions than most of them. Okay? Take the most famous one, the 17th century Shabtai Tzvi, the one who ultimately converted to Islam. Okay, so you know what we think we know today about Shabtai Tzvi is that he was a major manic depressive. In his manic phases, of course, he was, amazing, and people would believe anything he said, no matter how outrageous it seemed, just because of the force of his personality. But of course, you know, manic depressives do have depressive phases. And so he would disappear in those times. And he would just, you know, crawl off into a hole. And, you know, they didn't have medicine for it back then, right? And so one of his students kind of took advantage of him to declare that Shabtai Tzvi was indeed the Messiah. A fellow by the name known as Nathan of Gaza. And Nathan of Gaza, who was big into Kabbalah, produced all sorts of Kabbalistic truths as to why Shabtai Tzvi had to be the Messiah. And that sort of convinced a lot of people in the Jewish world, including a lot of rabbis, that this was the time.
He was claiming it too, though, right?
Well, he didn't really claim it until Nathan of Gaza came along. It became his advocate. So it became a major personality cult. Okay? And this is what you find in general with false messiah. But the goals of the Messiah are goals that are not necessarily impossible. Right? So let me show you what Deuteronomy says. This is Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14. Right? Parshat Nitzavim. right? So we usually read it right around Rosh Hashanah, right before. Right? So surely this Torah which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us, that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to observe it, right? So in other words, the goals associated with the Messiah, those things, no, they are doable. They are attainable. You just have to do the right stuff. And then maybe you get there. Right? That's how many Jews read this passage from Deuteronomy. Right? The goals are not impossible. Let me share with you one other rabbinic legend about the Messiah. It says the Messiah will come when all Israel keeps Shabbat for 2 weeks in a row. Okay, now we understand that is not going to happen, like starting this Saturday, right? Right? Not going to happen. But with enough publicity and enough determination, maybe we could make it happen. Right? You know? In principle, the Messianic age is no more than 2 weeks away. Right? And the prophets are very clear. If the poor are neglected, if the rich get special treatment, if merchants treat their customers, it's not going to come. Messianic time is not going to come. So we have to hope, because hope is better than despair. And the promise of hope allows us to face the future with a little bit more confidence. That's what the notion of the Messiah does for us, right? And that's why the prophets focused on it. Not all of them and not totally, but enough. Questions or comments up here? Mhm.
It seems like a pretty steep expectation
Yep.
to get everybody to do the same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
Particularly Jews.
humans are a little difficult.
I would
Think-
like to hear your discussion about Jesus.
Well, from a Jewish point of view, Jesus is a false Messiah.
Yeah,
That's all. I mean, did Jesus produce the results that the Messiah is supposed to produce?
no,
Okay,
that's,
That's
it's
all.
that simple.
That's all. yeah. And I have nothing bad to say about the guy, I mean, the fact that somebody's not the Messiah, oh, well, I'm sorry, I can't be the Messiah either.
Right.
So are you gonna knock me because I can't be the Messiah? I can't deliver what you need?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
he never claimed that he was the Messiah. It was his followers, right?
That's
Not so clear.
There's in the text, there's a lot of things.
He
like-
hedges it.
Yeah,
He's
he's,
sort of like Menachem Mendel Schneerson hedges it. Okay, but he's right around there. He is everything but directly.
yeah,
It strikes me that, following up on what Ronnie's saying, is, and Chris is absolutely right, I'm sure, but it was his surrounders, his up to the 2nd or 3rd century, it was his promoters and his marketers. And it's all connected with replacement theology. It's all connected with Christianity is going to replace
Replacing Judaism, yeah.
if there was no Jesus. Do you think that all these people from 1st century to modern would be even talking about the Jewish Messiah all that much?
that's an interesting point.
We were in large part, I think, I'm certainly not a scholar on this, but it strikes me that all these writers are responding to a threat of replacement. And the whole idea of
Hmm.
the Messiah was a major reason why the Christians thought that they should replace us, because the Messiah has come. They were fighting back to the Christians. And if Jesus never existed, it would be no big deal.
Yeah, the idea of replacement, I assume you all understand what Daniel means by that. Okay, so it means that the Jewish covenant has been replaced by a new covenant. Just like the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The New Covenant supersedes the Old, right? So that lasted in church theology right into the 20th century, right? And among people who tend to be more the theoreticians in different Christian sects, it's still around.
Oh, yeah, it's extremely still around.
I heard a Presbyterian minister.
I mean,
say
the
it.
average Presbyterian, the average UCC member,
Right.
have no problem with Jews. They're not in any way anti-Semitic. However, the people who really get higher up in those churches tend to be more attached to the deep theology, including replacement theology. So that's where you get problems. That's where you get, ridiculous resolutions about Israel, right?
Oh, for sure, because Paul wrote all about that. He was really
About replacement.
oh yeah, he was really the greatest spokesman for Jesus. I mean, even if you were to read through it, he was the one that really truly
Yes.
created. We came afterwards and
I guess what I'm saying though is that if that never happened, it seems to me that the Jewish conversation about the Messiah would be a lot less.
well, I think that's what
We are
Schneerson said.
responding to somebody telling us that we're being replaced.
Was there any significant discussion historically before the Roman occupation about a Messiah?
There is, but not nearly as much. I think to some extent you're correct, Daniel, that having a religion around you that is so, that it gets all of its energy out of the Messiah, you get a reaction in Judaism because of that. And that's why you have this ridiculously long passage in the Talmud that I just cited from, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be the need to say a whole lot about it, other than what the Messiah actually is supposed to do. You wouldn't have so much speculation about when it's going to happen. Now, of course, bad times also lead to some speculation.
Sure,
Can we hope for this to
right.
get us out of the mess we're in? Right? But there wouldn't be as much of that if it hadn't been.
That's great.
Is this the Shemitah year?
This one is the Shemitah year, yes.
So now we can track it and see what happens.
Yeah, okay, good luck with that. Yeah, other comments or questions before we go on? Because I just, wanted to deal with this issue of the Messiah before we go back to some other things. Okay, so, Jerry, did you have a comment or?
Question, shop sites will be after that or others, right? When-
There were before and after.
What
There's a
about-
whole book called The Jewish Messiahs.
Right. But they were, I don't know why they call them messiahs, so they didn't fulfill anything.
Right, they just, false advertising.
Why would you write a book about something like that?
Well, no, it's
I mean,
about
it's a
those who,
history book.
it's about those who claim to be messiahs.
Then what about now? What do we have?
Well, do you have any messianic claimers now? Not living ones. So there you are. Okay, I want to go back to a theme that we've touched on before, and it's very important in Heschel's treatment of the prophets. And I'm going to do this before we get into the next prophet we talk about, who is Jeremiah. And this is the term pathos, right, which he associates with the prophets. And let me just share what Heschel says about that. Pathos means So I thought you would want to know this. Pathos means God is never neutral, never beyond good and evil. He is always partial to justice. It is not a name for a human experience, but the name for an object of human experience. It is something the prophets meet with, something eventful, current, present in history as well as in nature. Now, he also says it's not a passion. No, God is not passionate in the same way that human beings are passionate. And yet, God has that impetus for human righteousness, for justice. Okay? The pathos results out of inequities. Right? And it's a form of relationship between God and the people. Right? Now, remember we said at the outset of the class, the prophet is someone who has insight, but is not necessarily someone who foretells the future.
Right.
Right? That's not his key role. Okay? So over time, a lot of people argued about, understanding God as beyond humanity, as being on a level all God's own, right? So, and the idea that God is self-sufficient. So why does God then need to have human beings be just? Why does God have need of human beings, period?
Right.
So here's his response to the argument about that.
And who are you quoting up there?
And this is from Heschel in the beginning of the chapter on comparisons and contrast, chapter 13. Okay. He says the idea of pathos is both a paradox and a mystery. He who created all should be affected by what a tiny particle of his creation does or fails to do. Right? Notice, why should God have such feelings, as it were, for what a human being does?
That's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Well, it's a remarkable concept, right? So now, pathos, he says, is both a disclosure of his concern and a concealment of his power. Now, what does that mean? A disclosure of his concern, meaning God, through the prophet, tells us that God cares about what human beings do and how human beings live and whether we do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God. Right? A concealment of his power, right? Because theoretically, if God has a lot of power, he could just bring it to bear on you, get you into shape, right? Right? God could make you do certain things and whip you into shape. But God doesn't do that. That's not the way it works. Right? The human mind, Heschel continues, the human mind may be inclined to associate the idea of God with absolute majesty, with unmitigated grandeur, with omnipotence and perfection. Well, that is how all of us think of God. We think of God as all powerful. Right? What Heschel says and what Judaism says is that God has given up some power so that people actually get to choose for themselves. Make the wrong choices, and God is not going to take your hand and slap you, bring you into line that way. I do think there are certain things that are built into the universe so that evil ultimately burns itself out. Right? But in the meantime, a lot of bad things can happen. Right? Continuing. God is most commonly thought of as a first cause that started the world's mechanism working, like the deist notion of, the watchmaker who starts the watch and then sets it aside and never has anything to do with it again. Right? And, you make a watch, you sell it, it's somebody else's problem. Right? Which continues to function according to its own inherent laws and processes. That's how the world works with its own processes. It seems inconceivable that the supreme being should be involved in the affairs of human existence. And what Heschel goes on to explain is that that's a very Greek notion. That's something that evolves out of Greek philosophy. If you want to read the details on that in this chapter, you can. Right? I think for our purposes, it's sufficient simply to point out that that's where that idea comes from, but it's not a Jewish idea. That, that God should not be involved in human existence. Right? Let me skip a couple of pages here and give you a more succinct view of what Heschel has to say about this. Biblical religion begins with God addressing man, with his entering into covenant with man. God is in need of man. A supreme being apathetic and indifferent to man may denote an idea, but not the living God of Israel. Right? So some of you may remember very early on in this class, I mentioned the Kabbalistic notion of Tzorech Gavoa, the higher need. You just put that up there for you. Make you guys look around to see it. Tzorech Gavoa. Tzorech in Hebrew means need. Gavoa means on high. The higher need, right? And it's a Kabbalistic concept, which is that God needs us to do certain things in order to make the world operate the way He needs us to make it operate. Right? So if I do something, if I do a good deed, or if I offer a prayer with a whole heart, that actually has a cosmic effect. I may or may not be able to trace how that effect exactly works, although Kabbalah gives you a framework for how to do that. But it's just, you have the power to make an effect in the cosmos. Right? Heschel, in many of his books, including this one, is kind of reinterpreting Kabbalistic ideas in ways that they can make sense to 20th century thinkers. Right? Yeah.
Can I come back to something that you said just a couple of minutes ago relating to omnipotence? And if you say it's not really relevant to where we're going, that's okay. But you said that God has given up the ability or the right to control everything by giving humans free will.
Yeah.
You didn't use those words.
Yeah.
But so if God is an omnipotent and gave that to us, He can take it back. So
Theoretically, yes.
So is it that God gave it to us, or that's just the way it worked out and we had it and it didn't have anything to do with God giving it to us?
Yeah, theoretically, it's hard to imagine putting the chick back in the egg.
Or is it what came first, the chicken or the egg?
That's not what I'm saying.
But okay.
Yeah, I don't think it works that way. I think God has kind of, use another image, let the genie out of the bottle. And it's not something we can put back. We can't say, okay, God, we're tired of free will. We're tired of having to make all these choices.
Well, it's not us saying it, it's God deciding.
Well, that's right, but but theoretically, we might say that, we keep making bad choices. So come on, God, fix things and we'll give up free will. And God says, I'm sorry, that is not how it works. You don't get to do that. And I'm not going to go along with that. Right? Because I need you to grow up into the things you need to do. That's all. Yeah. Somebody else had it. Yeah.
So this concept of tikkun alone, how does that fit into that?
It doesn't actually. I mean, it does and it doesn't. Tikkun olam is a term that's sort of been co-opted in modern times. What it really meant in early rabbinic text was the public good. In other words, why would we make it easier for someone to collect tzedakah? Mipnei tikkun olam, because it was for the public good. Right? It doesn't mean that, you could automatically reach your hand into the push key and take out whatever you felt was appropriate, right? But, we made it easier. Why? Tikkun olam, right? So a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with politics today, right? Or even, a whole lot of things got described as mipnei tikkun olam. If anybody wants to know more about that, I have an article in my computer I can send you that deals with the details. It's a whole nother topic. Tikkun, however, did become a Kabbalistic concept. Right? They sort of, kind of made a reach in Kabbalistic thinking to kind of co-opt that term. But that was spiritual tikkun, right? Not a political tikkun, the way it's been sort of co-opted today. So now, everybody loves to use the word tikkun olam, the term tikkun olam, right? When what they're usually talking about is, a certain political position.
Social justice.
Yeah. So conservatives may also want social justice, right? They want to accomplish it or believe it should be accomplished in a different way than maybe a more, liberal segment of society wants. But tikkun olam, utilizing that term for a, let's say, progressive opinion it's a reach. Yeah, Daniel.
Of all the things that I've heard or read about Heschel's description, articulation of the nature of God, my favorite is God is ineffable. It is the great paradox of his thinking. He says we cannot describe God with words.
Yeah.
And then uses a billion words to describe God.
Yeah.
So all of this is kind of confusing to me, because the truth of the matter is we're not going to ever know.
Yeah, well, okay, so understand the word that Daniel used here, very important. Ineffable, meaning that which cannot be expressed in words, which Heschel goes on to explain in great detail, Right? But, you know, any good theologian would do that, right? He just did it much more eloquently than most.
Yeah, thank God he wrote this stuff down,
Oh, yeah.
because it's really shocking.
Yeah.
how
Well, and the
profound
other
it
thing, you
is.
gotta remember, English was his fifth language.
That's just crazy.
So,
It is amazing.
It's very hard for me to read him. I mean, I can read one paragraph 3 times and still.
Oh, and-
absolutely.
yeah, I did
Every
not
sentence.
understand this initially when I got into Heschel as a youngster, because the first book by Heschel that I read was much, much easier reading than a lot of his stuff, because it was basically talks that he had given, you know, sort of slightly revised, but put together into a book.
Which book is that?
That's Man's Quest for God, which is his book on prayer. Okay. So for instance, one of them is a talk that he gave at the Reform Rabbinical Convention, right? And of course, you know, he told them what he thought they should hear. And he had a different talk for conservative rabbis. That's also in the book. Okay. But very slightly revised in that book. That was the first book by Heschel that I read. And I read it when I was a senior in high school.
That's a little heavy for a 17, 18.
But that book isn't. That book,
Just more
if
practical.
you're, I don't know, so you're a 17-year-old with a good vocabulary,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
So that book is easier. You can actually read a half a chapter a day, right? Whereas, you know, those of you who have been reading a little bit in the prophets, you're dipping into that and you say, well, I could do 2 pages a day, you know? Or maybe not, or maybe only 1, or maybe a paragraph. If, you know, when I was in college, I was a junior. So I remember I was going into my junior year. I started reading God in Search of Man, book that I quoted from
Yes,
last week,
That's right.
last class. And that is a much more difficult book.
Yes,
Took me a year to read that.
Yeah,
I could not do it in a year.
yeah, but it's tremendous. By the way, I'm reading right now the Hebrew version, the original version of his book, Torah Mina Shamayim, but when it was translated, Heavenly Torah. And basically, I'm doing a page a day. First of all, I don't read Hebrew as fast as English, okay? Contrary to public opinion. And the other thing is, there's just so much to chew on that it requires, just, you have to focus a lot.
Shabbat's pretty easy to read.
The Sabbath is one of his easier books, and also The Earth is the Lord's. It's not an academic book. It's a book with a very different purpose. Earth is the Lord's is a great entry into Heschel's work, because it is a tribute to the culture of Eastern European Jewry, which was destroyed. And it was written in the wake of the Holocaust. And of course, Heschel had grown up in Eastern Europe. And so, but his point was not to memorialize the 6 million. It was to memorialize the culture that had been destroyed and what was worth trying to rebuild out of that culture. So that's also a good one to look at if you want to just start by dipping your toe into Heschel's teachings. Then you get some more difficult ones, right? His 2 theological books, Man is Not Alone and God in Search of Man, those to me are the most difficult, but they're doable. You just have to take it slow. It's a long-term project. What is Man? Which was a series of lectures that he gave at Stanford in the early 60s. That's also slow going, but it's doable. Insecurity of Freedom is an easier read because, again, it's a series of talks that he had given or some short articles that he had written. So, for instance, one of the essays in The Insecurity of Freedom is about aging. And it is a talk he gave at the White House Council for Aging. Okay? He didn't live to be that old. Okay? He died when he was 65.
It's a shame. Yeah, it's a shame.
You'd think, with as many books as he wrote, you would think he lived to 140.
Right.
But so anyway, that's another more reachable book. Yeah.
Did he ever debate with atheists or with other religious groups
No,
on the
and
concept
in
of the
fact,
existence of
He
God?
fought atheism, and he talks about this a little bit in one of the last things he did, which was this interview he had with Carl Stern of NBC.
You told me to watch it and I did.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, I think it's in that. If not, it's in one of the other essays in Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, which is, it's all potpourri of a lot of stuff that Heschel did from the beginning of his career until the end. But his idea, his feeling is that atheism is just laziness, right? It's a failure to see that which cannot be put into words, the ineffable, right? That, that anyone with eyes to see and a willingness to see can see evidence for God's presence in the universe.
Don't you have to have a good teacher to teach you those things?
Well, that's why I'm here.
Well said.
I have a fantasy of Ayn Rand and Heschel in the same room debating, because they were both intellectual contemporaries on opposite sides
Yes.
of the
Yes.
world in the 50s.
You just keep asking her questions and freak her out. probably.
Yeah.
I don't
Very
know how
smart.
that would have turned out.
It'd be interesting though.
Yeah, but I have confidence that Heschel would have dealt with her.
Oh, he would have tied her in knots and thrown her out the door.
She's pretty tough, man, maybe.
I don't know. I don't know.
That would be cool.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how does the rest of the Jewish world view Heschel? Besides,
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
because
I think Heschel has made a tremendous mark in the world of Catholicism.
Catholicism?
When Heschel died, they published this magazine. I think it's called America, right? But it's really Catholic teachings in America. And they devoted an entire issue to Heschel's teachings, right? It has taken a while for a lot of American Jews to come around to examining Heschel and Heschel's teaching. And I think that's largely because he was just so far ahead of his time.
Yeah.
The dominant forces in the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was training conservative rabbis, were the people who taught text, like Saul Lieberman, who was the rector and the head of the Talmud department. He was like, I've said this before, forgive me if you've heard me talk about this. The seminary was a real hierarchy. Lieberman was the 10th, okay? And if you taught Talmud and codes, you were below Lieberman, you were maybe a 7 or an 8, right? The chancellor, Louis Finkelstein, who was chancellor for several decades, till 72, he was about an 8. The chancellor, right? If you taught other subject, if you taught, let's say, philosophy or history at seminary, you were maybe a 5 or a 6. And if you were a teacher of mysticism,
What?
you might be a 3, right? Well, you know, one of the most famous stories about the seminary is when Gershom Scholem, who really created the field of Jewish mysticism as an academic field, came to give a talk at the seminary. And Lieberman introduced him with the following comments. He said, "You know what I think of mysticism. Mysticism is Narishkeit. But the history of Narishkeit is scholarship.
Mm,
And so I present to you the world's leading scholar, etc."
mm.
Right? That was their attitude towards many of the things that concerned Heschel.
What did that word mean?
Narishkeit, nonsense.
Oh, my.
Yeah, it was
I don't
nonsense.
know Irish.
So,
Yes, yeah.
So, and there were, you know, because there was such a hierarchy at the seminary, this is the institution that trained Rabbi Malin. Okay, just so you know. So it has its impact in Beth Yeshurun and in our history as an institution. Okay. So, you know, if you ever, those of you who remember Rabbi Malin, I know you do, because he was not forgettable easily. You know, he also was part of that hierarchy. You know, if you were a student at the seminary and in that kind of hierarchy, what were you? You were maybe a 1. And that only if you got into the seminary, right? Okay, so
we're all zeros.
I'm sorry.
We're all zeros.
Oh, yeah, I mean, and the people that you were going out to serve as a rabbi. Yeah, so many people inherited this kind of hierarchical thinking rather than saying, oh, I'm going to lift up the members of my congregation and, you know, help them to be more spiritual and more knowledgeable and more of this and that. It was more, I'm up here and you're down there. Sort of like the bark sanctuary. I'm up here and you're down there. No, I don't mean that pejoratively against anyone today.
That's interesting, though. That's an interesting point.
I choose to think it's just so we can see everybody better.
Okay, I'm glad you think that way because that enables you to function as a normal Jew should function in a sanctuary. Okay, I will tell you that's probably not why the sanctuary was created the way it was created. I think there are 2 reasons why it was created that way. One is because we built a building to express certain relationships. If you want to build a sanctuary that conveys a sense of closeness with God, that's one way to do it. That wouldn't be the bark sanctuary.
No, it does feel very, when I sit back there, it does feel so far away and the seats are so high.
And that's,
It's strange
and
to me.
it conveys a sense of distance.
Yeah, it sure does.
Distance from God,
Right.
distance even from the people who are up there, the
100%.
rabbis, the cantor, and so forth.
I don't feel
Now-
that way.
Well,
good.
that's good. I'm glad, because it didn't work for you.
Right.
You know, you were able to have a normal relationship with the people and
Yeah.
God, right? In spite of it. But I'm just telling you, that's not why it was built. And now the other theory I have as to why it was built that way is because, you know, in 1960, we Jews, or at least some of us, had kind of made it in
Absolutely.
Houston,
Mhm.
right? And Beth Yeshurun was built to express the notion that we Jews had made it here in Houston,
That
And
was
in America.
98%.
right? Now, 60 years later, we forget that because we're not there. You know, we've long made it, right? Most of us, we don't worry about that Narish guy, right? It's just, it's not an issue anymore. Of course, we Jews have made it. Right? Doesn't mean there aren't poor Jews, but as a people, we are very prosperous in America.
And the heck with River Oaks.
And the heck with River Oaks, right? You know, so we didn't live in River Oaks. Now we
Yeah,
can,
we do.
but who needs it? Right?
That's interesting you say that, because I've done lots of plumbing work east of downtown, which is not a Jewish neighborhood anymore, and I used to find mezuzahs everywhere.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful homes. I mean, I would go in and I was
Yeah.
shocked at the woodworking and the
Yeah.
floors, and it's just
But-
incredible.
But
Yeah,
1960,
near UH too.
you know, I think the building was dedicated in 61.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so they very deliberately created this grandiose building for one or two reasons. One of those two, I think.
That's interesting.
And was it ever actually said? I doubt it, because, you know, those kinds of things are subconscious very often,
I think the first one was subconscious, maybe, I don't know,
maybe.
but the second one was absolutely not.
I don't know. Well, that would have been from Rabbi Malin.
Okay. I'm not gonna argue.
Okay, I'm sorry to have gone over time. We'll carry on next.